So without further ado, Jacob Grace, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And thanks everybody who's joined in here today. I'm looking forward to talking about agroforestry. So I'm going to start by just kind of giving a short overview of agroforestry in the Midwest, and then pass it off to John and Jacob to get into some more of the details. Like Greg said, my name is Jacob Grace. I work with the Savannah Institute, which is a nonprofit working throughout the Midwest to support more wide-scale agroforestry in the Midwest. So agroforestry, there are a lot of different technical definitions, but basically it's farming with trees. And the benefits of agroforestry are as diverse as the forms it can take. So I'm going to try to show a lot of different pictures of agroforestry today, but it really can look a lot of different ways, and there are a lot of different benefits that come with that. One of the first being it can produce a multifunctional landscape where you can have a field or a farm serving multiple functions. It can diversify income sources for farmers and landowners, build soil, reduce water runoff, provide wildlife habitat, sequester carbon, and provide aesthetic and cultural benefits. So sometimes those are most important of all, and play a really big role in people wanting to adopt agroforestry on their land. The USDA recognizes 5 main agroforestry practices, and I'm going to talk about each of those in a little bit more detail here. But also just want to point out, like I said, agroforestry can take many different forms, especially once you start getting into other parts of the world, like the tropics. It looks completely different there. And also just point out that agroforestry has been going on for thousands of years, really, and is probably one of the oldest forms of agriculture. So it's not really something new. It's just not super common in the Midwest these days. So that's what we're working on at the Savannah Institute, is trying to build some of our capacity for agroforestry. So the 5 practices recognized by USDA are windbreaks, riparian buffers, alley cropping, silvopasture, and forest farming. So like I said, I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Windbreaks, I think, are fairly self-explanatory. I know from traveling through Iowa that you all are familiar with windbreaks. But I think the main point here is that windbreaks can serve other functions as well besides just blocking wind and affecting air movements. So I can also provide some of these other benefits that I was talking about. Won't dwell on those, but also just mentioning riparian buffers, which similarly have to do more with interrupting the flow of water as opposed to the flow of air, and trying to improve waterways, prevent erosion, improve water quality, things like that. Also something that you're probably used to seeing. Alley cropping, I'm going to talk about a little bit more here. So alley cropping is starting to introduce trees into our cropping systems. And as you can see in this nice graphic here, it kind of lays out what alley cropping looks like in practice, where you can plant rows of trees in with summer annuals to start out, and then as those trees start to mature, you might switch over to cropping with winter annuals. And then as the trees get even more mature, they eventually turn into the primary crop, and you might be doing some haying or grazing or something in between. So a common theme in talking about implementing agroforestry is, what do you do for the first 10 years or so when the trees are just growing? So alley cropping is one of the great solutions to that, where you can be growing your trees in a field, but also continuing to grow crops in between those trees. And this is an example of what that might look like. So this is at one of the Savannah Institute's demonstration farms in Illinois, doing some fairly large scale cropping, but also doing some tree plantings in between. And if you can see, I know it's a little fuzzy on my screen, but each of those little white lines is a tree tube that's protecting a young tree that's been planted in this field. So agroforestry can be done on a lot of different scales, and this is an example of how it can be done on a pretty large scale if you want to do it that way. Moving on to silvopasture. This is also a very popular form of agroforestry and one of the ways that you can integrate it into things that you're already doing on your farm. So silvopasture is the intentional integration of trees, pasture, and livestock managed as a single system. And it's important for us to separate this from just unmanaged grazing in the woods, because there's a history of environmental degradation and just general bad management of people doing unmanaged grazing in trees, and that's not what silvopasture is. With silvopasture, we're trying to get the 3 different components all working together and having that multifunctional landscape that we're looking for. Silvopasture is a little bit more common maybe in the southeastern part of the country, where they have things like pine plantations, other types of trees that they're raising for timber, and then doing grazing in between. But it's also something that can definitely be done in the Midwest. And it's also worth noting that, so what we have a picture of here is starting with an empty pasture and planting some trees in that pasture. We're going to be hearing a little bit more about this from Jacob later. But there are actually 2 ways that you can convert to silvopasture. One is starting with an empty pasture and planting trees. But another thing you can do, which is maybe you start to see the effects of more quickly, is if you have some poor quality timber, you can thin that timber out. And with that thinning and leaving a few trees behind and adding the forage or improving your forage, you can get a silvopasture system that way. So for a quicker implementation, that's often what people are looking at. And then the last thing I'm just going to touch on and not get into a lot of detail is forest farming. And this is also something that's not super common in the Midwest, but maybe more common in other parts of the country. And this is raising different crops or different products that prefer to be under a full forest canopy and who like to be shaded. So, for example, that could be raising shiitake mushroom logs, like Greg Judy is doing in central Missouri. A lot of different options for some high value specialty crops that can be grown actually in a forest with full shade. So that's an option as well. I don't want to take a lot more time here, but I just want to mention that the Savannah Institute has a lot of resources where you can learn more about these agroforestry practices. And we also have some infographics talking about some of the key tree crops that we are working on here in the Midwest. And I think I'm going to skip over these because I'm running out of time, but some of the main crops that we have identified as having a lot of potential in the Midwest are chestnuts, hazelnuts, elderberries, and black currants. And so that's something we're looking at. If you're interested in agroforestry, those could be good crops to investigate more. And with that, I think I will wrap things up here. I'm happy to answer more questions about this at the end, but I'll go ahead and pass it on to John.
Thank you. All right. I will share my screen here, get my slides up. Okay, well, yeah, welcome everyone. We appreciate you joining. We always love this discussion and like talking about agroforestry. I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Jonathan Hendricks. I work for the Sustainable Iowa Land Trust. I'm a relatively new hire since October, and I was brought on to help utilize agroforestry, but also to complete some research that I'll get into later to create some tools for farmers and landowners so that those resources that we need to get started to see how we might cash flow agroforestry if we're interested are consolidated in one place. And we've got some data-backed cash flow budget sheets. So that's something I'm excited to be working on. My wife and I, we live in Avoca, southwest Iowa. We've got 5 acres. And so I practice what I preach. So we do silvopasture as well. moving on here, just to give a brief explanation, a little bit about silt, if you're unfamiliar, we will play a video here from our board president, Stuart. I always love that video. I think it explains what we do at silt pretty well. So in relation to agroforestry, a couple of the things that Stuart talked about that I'd love to stress is that agroforestry really is one of those options, a tool in the belt that we can use to be more regenerative and to create opportunity that is outside of this current system of farming that we're in. For beginning farmers, we know that there are a lot of hurdles. For folks that want to get into agriculture, there's some of these hurdles as well. And agroforestry is one way where we know that it can be profitable. We know it can be sustainable, and we know that it has regenerative properties. So in the agroforestry adoption category here that I'm going to talk about, and Jacob talked on just a little bit, but when we're talking about the benefits for individual farmers, whether you already have a traditional system or whether you are looking at becoming a beginning farmer, the idea of diversity is huge. We know that this monoculture system is not sustainable, that corn and soybean farming is barely economically sustainable. And agroforestry really solves a lot of those issues. And then even within agroforestry itself, there's so many different practices like alley cropping, where you can even diversify that income multiple years, have a cash crop like alley cropping in the meantime while these trees are developing. But also there's other diversity as well. So you're diversifying your total quantity of crops. If you've got livestock, incorporating trees, all the benefits of that, shrubs, other perennials, but then diversifying your biology, your microbiology on your farm as well. And that kind of gets to the soil health properties that we were talking about. Jacob alluded to the fact that it's tremendously beneficial. We know that riparian buffers are extremely common simply because of the power of trees and those deep, strong root systems and their longevity. So we do this, we know that they have benefits. And I believe agroforestry, we would probably argue that let's make those trees productive. You know, they have those benefits. A lot of trees have those benefits. So let's let them grow chestnuts or, you know, pawpaws. Let's make them something that we could eat. Lots of livestock benefits. Jacob talked about that a little bit, you know, shelter, windbreaks, and then just general, of course, habitat. So, you know, we see nowadays, we see these barren fields of corn, soybeans and other things. And this type, it's got the visual appeal like Jacob said, but it's also going to be an opportunity to increase and protect pollinators, insects, and some of that wildlife that we also desperately need to keep a healthy ecosystem here. So that's for the farmer, but also for all of Iowa and just the environment in general. This is a way, it's a method that we can move more towards that regenerative form of agriculture that we're trying to get to, where we are not mining, we're not extracting, but that what we use, what we do on our farms is more of a transfer of energy in a balanced way between our plants, between our animals. Of course, with water quality, we do know that these trees can act as a wonderful buffer. It slows down water runoff. We know that across the country, we are losing about 5,000 pounds of topsoil per acre per year. And, you know, we use terraces, we use buffer strips, and trees, and especially productive trees, can be a solution to that as well. In terms of the climate, we also know the Amazon is very important for a reason, and all trees are more important, very important for that reason, is that they sequester carbon, they use it to build their structure, they return it to our soils, they keep it on our land, so it has a positive impact. The more trees that we can plant, the better we'll be off in the future. And then lastly here, because we talked about that agroforestry may not be that popular or may not be that common in this area, we can see it as an opportunity for growth. You know, instead of seeing it as potentially a challenge of where we might market this, but consider that there's really an untapped market, so to speak, but a lot of folks that are doing it have tremendous success selling this. So there's opportunity for employment benefits, or just community building benefits, and being able to grow chestnuts and make them available to community is just going to do nothing but make your neighbors happy, which is always a good thing. So next up, barrier to adoption. We know that access to affordable land is just, it's one of those issues. It's the nature of the beast. So for those of you looking to get into agroforestry, thinking about it, we know that that is going to be one of those hurdles. And so in addition to the know-how of finding that information, one of the things that I'm interested in looking into, and for those of you that might want to try to start farming and incorporating agroforestry, look into the concept of trying to negotiate longer term leases. We see a lot of short-term leases being very common in agriculture, but as you can imagine, with a tree or a crop like that that might mature, or a vine that might mature at 5, 7, 10 years, it's going to be very necessary to address that issue and build relationships and come to agreements with folks that are willing to sort of be patient and understand the benefit of what this type of movement towards this culture could be. And that's a culture change. So I just want to throw up some great partners that we have here that offer some wonderful technical and financial assistance. So the Savannah Institute, for those of you who are interested looking into agroforestry, you want to go out and find some more information. The Savannah Institute is incredible. They have so many infographics and a lot of research that's evidence-based, and there's also some budget sheets that are terrific as well. Practical Farmers of Iowa, Moses, I can't get to them all. And then of course it's still, like I mentioned, we will be developing some enterprise budget sheets, and as their specialist, I'm always happy to talk to anybody interested. Real quick, there's also technical and financial assistance available with the in the public funding mechanisms as well. So through the USDA, we have a wonderful National Agroforestry Center located right in Lincoln, Nebraska. Terrific people. They've got a website that you can go out and check. And they also have similar things. And I'll show a little bit of that as well. But some of that assistance that you can secure is covers agroforestry. So it may surprise people because it's not that common, but there is cost sharing incentives. Like I'll show below here, you see that in the EQIP schedule, we're able to get specific dollars per tree that we plant because this is so important, and it is a priority, and it's got such great conservation benefits. So this is the National Agroforestry website, just to kind of show you. You can click on any of the different practices, and it can give you some information and see if your state supports that. And then lastly, in the financial assistance category, we would be remiss to say that even if those traditional methods aren't necessarily going to get us covered, we may have to go to some more non-traditional things that take a little bit more work for us. And that would be, if you're looking to get into this, reach out with private investors. The slow money concept of loans, where the folks that would be giving these impact investors would be interested in what we're doing and the things that we'd be able to accomplish. So they might be willing. So that's something that's relationship building that can give you the opportunity to fund something, get something started, and to get some seed money, no pun intended. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about with financial assistance, maybe one of the most important and fun parts here, is the tax incentives. So maybe it's little known, but there is a lot of tax incentive available for those, for beginning farmers. For example, if you're a cash renter, you can, you can deduct 5% of your annual income, or actually of your cash rent from your taxes. 5% doesn't sound that exciting, but it's pretty cool. Try to click on here. I've got another animation. And if you're in a crop share lease, it can be 15%. And then the real exciting parts here, and what we do at SILT, placing conservation perpetual easements on land so that that land is protected forever, it stays in agriculture, and provides opportunity for future generations to keep producing clean, healthy food for our communities. And if you are a landowner, and for example, as this relates to agroforestry, you're thinking about doing that, or you're a beginning farmer that is going to buy some land and we're wondering financially how that might all work out. If you place your land in a conservation easement, you still own it, of course, but just attached to the deed is this easement that says it won't be developed outside the parameters of the easement. So it's going to stay in agricultural production or, you know, and other things that you might dictate. But for 16 years, landowners can deduct 50% of their annual gross income, which is quite impressive. And not just farm income, that's for landowners, 50% of your overall income. And then for farmers and ranchers, you are able to deduct for 16 years, so for the first year and 15 years thereafter, 100% of your annual gross income if that land is placed in a conservation easement. So, and I know this is a plug for silt and what we do day in and day out, but as it pertains to agroforestry, when we think about the fact that the return on investment might take a while, that it may be, you know, in general, the folks that are thinking about planting a 100-year-old or a tree and thinking 100 years in the future or a 10-year return on investment, they may be the same type of people that would also want to see that tree reach 100 years and be able to provide fruit and nuts and healthy food for future generations as well. So it's just something to consider. Lastly, I want to point to a couple other really important resources. So if you're interested in having somebody come out, discuss with you, look at your land, do a farm walk with you, we offer free consultations through my peer Joe here, you see with a really cute goat, which was totally intentional. And he's a great guy and he can come out. He specializes in specialty crops and some of these more sustainable farming techniques. He's been all over and he works with a lot of farmers and he helps us also monitor and protect the land that we have in conservation easements. So the next thing I want to point you to is that Silt published an Iowa Landowner's Guide to Sustainable Food Crops, which is available at silt.org. Terrific resource for those interested, maybe not only in agroforestry, but just in general, producing food in a sustainable way. It's a great resource. And I would encourage all of you to read it. And then after you read it, we have a survey for you, by the way. I know that you'd love to hear that. And I will end with saying that where I started was that I'm working on a research project that just got going. We'll be working on it over the next couple of years with case studies and field days, but some collaboration or conglomeration of resources, and maybe more importantly, plug and play cash flow budget sheets so that those that are interested, instead of necessarily just having an idea, you can go out, and our hope is that you can throw in some combinations of some different plants, some different species, some livestock combinations, and be able to see sort of the hard and fast data. And so just as a tease, right, we always have to say that we know that chestnut farmers, when the trees mature, are often able to get $7,000 an acre. And if you can combine that with some of the other incentives and see this as part of a multicultural system, it's a terrific way to make a farm diverse, sustainable for the environment, but also sustainable for the environment as well. So thank you for having me. I will turn it over to the actual star of the show, the man who is doing this work, Jacob Marty.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'll share my screen here. Is working. Get all my stuff out of the way. There. Oops. Present. All right. Is that looking all right for everyone? Okay, so my name is Jacob Marty. My farm is Greenfire Farm. It's in southern Wisconsin, so apologize I'm not from Iowa, but hopefully you'll excuse me for that. So I this will be my 7th year in 2021, returning back to my family's farm and transition it from a conventional dairy and row crop farm into a regenerative and multi-species grazing operation. So as you can imagine, we started out with row crops, bare fields, and my vision long-term is to have a very robust and diverse farm with agroforestry systems. We also keep meadows and wetland areas and restore those into our farms. So when Jacob asked me to participate, I kind of told him that, I'll talk about an agroforestry planting and establishment that I did that had a lot of issues with it and what I stated. So I kind of told him that I was a little worried that I don't have a whole lot of information to share other than the lessons that I learned, and a lot of the failures, the things that did go well and that I can try to compound on in the future, and the things that didn't go well and definitely learn from them and account for them in the future as well when we do more tree plantings. So again, our farm, we raise pasture-raised animals seasonally. So we do laying hens, pastured broilers, turkeys. We do pigs, sheep, and grass-fed beef. And then I direct market it online and through farmers markets in the summer. So here's some pictures of the animals on the farm. What I'm working on, my long-term goal is to try to return this farm to its natural community that what might have been, 100, 200, 1,000 years ago, based on the idea that those natural systems are the most adapted and evolved to the present conditions, soil quality, soil type, the amount of precipitation, the seasons, all these different components that all the living, plant communities, wildlife communities, the insect populations that they have to deal with every year, that they're going to be adapted to this particular area of the world in the most optimal way. So looking at what that might be on our farm is most likely savannas in a lot of the area, and those provide a lot of those benefits that Jacob and Jonathan mentioned about, for the farmer, for the livestock, for the community, for the wildlife, all those type of things that are stuff that we're trying to capture, and for me, try to promote to my neighbors, to my community, so that this rural community starts to adopt these, and over the coming decades and generations, that this will be the dominant and dominant way of farming and producing food without extracting, like was said in that video, but regenerating the quality of our communities. So my whole goal is to have a livable and abundant place to live and work and to share. So when we got started, again, we were a row crop farm. So we got started with a 50-acre farm. So my dad was a dairy farmer. He bought a farm from my great uncle and my great grandpa. And so we have a pretty large scale farm. So we're working on decent sized chunks of land. So this first pasture that we started with back in 2015 was a 50-acre cornfield. And this was a pretty common sight from our farm, but also our neighbors, of a bare field about 6 to 8 months of the year, and what field conditions were for planting in the spring. So we wanted to plant this down and start the route of succession into a savanna type system. And the first part of that is a perennial, like grassland or pasture, prairie type of thing. And for us, we're gonna look like a pasture that we're gonna graze. So it's my dad and I, April 15, 2015, we got started. And we planted a lot of diverse mix. And this is what it turned out to look like that first year. So lots of forbs, lots of grasses, lots of clover. And right away we started seeing insects and stuff like that return. And I want to mention, I grew up on this farm. So I grew up to love, being able to play with frogs and puddles that formed after July thunderstorms. I remember driving around just around our farm and having our windshield just splattered with bugs. And those things are gone now. The frog population on our farm is now starting to recover after 5 years of doing this. But when I first came back, 2015, we had pretty much a silent farm, kind of like Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson. It just reminded me of that, and how much rehabilitation we need to do to our land and to our communities. And starting to see this is very rewarding. And we've had a lot of plants, insects, and birds that are coming back to the farm. And hopefully that just keeps on cascading into other species, and give me a lot of happiness and joy, but also have all those other ecosystem services and things that they provide for the resilience to our land and communities. So this is that same field, and kind of what it looks like. So this would be right before cattle would go in and graze. And this is with the cattle grazing in there. And then we got some pictures of how we're raising our animals. So like our layer hens, they live in a mobile greenhouse that we kind of tow around the farm, and so they're constantly getting fresh new bugs, grass, all that type of stuff. And so our whole understanding or principles with raising cattle and livestock is that they deserve and they are the healthiest and happiest when they are outside. They're getting abundant access to fresh air, fresh grass, and sunshine. And so I came back to the farm with that goal, and that was our predominant goal, is raising these animals and providing cash flow and running a profitable, sustainable business. And working trees into that has been a learning experience for us, and I'll talk about that. So again, we're trying to get towards a oak savanna, and most people will be pretty familiar with it, but it's like about 30 to 70% canopy cover onto the ground, and it varies depending on what your goals are or the natural conditions. And on our farm, like I said, that if I'm looking back and imagining 100,000 years ago what it looked like, we pretty much wiped out over the past generations, and my ancestry have taken out all the trees to put in crop fields. And luckily there's one remnant like acre of our farm that has been left. And this is what it kind of looks like. So I am able to look at this as motivation. Keep going here for what I want to do long term. So another angle of it, here are some sheep in the pasture right next to it. They had access to go in underneath the trees, but also go out into the open pasture land too. And you can, one thing that I've noticed is when animals are grazing underneath trees, whether it's sheep, pigs, cattle, chickens, they feel more at ease. You can just sense that they are more relaxed. They're enjoying themselves. There's just a noticeable and magnitude's difference in their quality of life, and also makes it more enjoyable for us to be around. So whether that's because they're getting more shade or there's more cover so they don't feel as exposed to, these are animals that regardless of how long they've been with us and domesticated, they still have these instincts that they are vulnerable. They need to be watching for predators. And so having some type of cover does wonders for their stress levels, and that cascades into how healthy they're going to be, how resilient they're going to be potentially to disease and pests and those type of things. So like I said, those livestock benefits are noticeable immediately. And unfortunately, like I said, we only have like an acre of our farm that this is present on, and it's in my backyard, so it's not even like accessible that much. So but that's what we're kind of working towards. So this is the sheep. We love having them in the backyard too, looking out through our windows and seeing them. And then we also have one kind of riparian area that's a seasonal drainage way that has some walnuts and plums and a few other tree species that for one paddock that the cattle can have access to. Everything else has been basically clear cut and left for row crop. So very open, and you can tell the cattle love, this is their favorite paddock by far on the farm. So why is that? Well, we're trying to replicate that around the farm, and that's a process. So here's some other pictures of the cattle underneath these trees, and we're grazing them for maybe 1 to 3 days and then giving them a month and a half of recovery before they be in there, maybe 3 or 4 times in the season that they would be grazing underneath these. So keep going. So silvopasture lesson. So first I'll tell you kind of what we did. So back in 2016, the second year, I planted about 8 acres and 1,000 trees. And I did a lot of research leading into it, and I was really jazzed about things. So I kind of put into, it was on a hillside, so a pseudo kind of key line, planting the rows. I had 45-foot row spacing to have kind of alley cropping, but more alley grazing for pigs and sheep and potentially cattle as well. And 10-foot spacings within the rows between trees. And if anyone's familiar with this permaculture orchard DVD, highly recommend it. I did a nap pattern, which was like a nitrogen fixing tree, which was redbud in our case, an apple, and then a pear, and having diversity going through. And then I kind of added in some fruit and nut trees beyond that too, so like chestnut, pecan, oak, basswood, that type of stuff for canopy. And then I use 3 different types of protecting the trees: Miracle Pro, Blue X, tree tubes, and Arbor Shield. So I'll talk about that. And then I did a root dip. And so this is kind of a picture just showing that key line. We didn't follow the contours exactly, but just gave us a general sense. We have quite a bit of precipitation. We have clay soils, so water holding isn't the biggest concern right there. So didn't follow it exactly.
Jacob, can you explain key line a little bit for those that don't understand it?
Yeah, I don't understand it 100%, but key line is basically using the contour of the land and planting within that. Sometimes they'll make berms or swales that will capture water running straight downhill and then slow and spread and distribute that on the contours kind of parallel or perpendicular to the downhill effects are basically that the water wants to take. So it basically spreads out the water, captures it, slows it down, and you make use of it more. So I wanted to do that. A lot of farms, it seemed like were doing type of systems like that. So hopefully that's kind of clear. So again,
thanks.
Yep. And so this is kind of an example of like what the pattern of species that we would have planted in this. So we'd have like a canopy tree like chestnut, pecan, or oak, or basswood, because we want to have lots of pollinators. And then an apple or pear, and then a redbud, and then our apple or the other one that we didn't do first, apple or pear, and then another canopy tree. And so these redbuds and basswoods, a lot of pollinator support, hopefully that they would help the fruit and nut trees produce more. And long term, my goal is shade and forage for our livestock. Wasn't necessarily set up for more of a commercial harvest for humans, maybe a U-pick, but more aesthetics and livestock comfort and forage. So this is what it looked like. And this was after 1 year of planting. We had some trees that were already growing out the 4-foot tubes. So we had really good rainfall that year. We didn't have any irrigation set up. I hardly did any weeding, all this type of stuff. Just everything went perfect, it seemed like. And that was almost my undoing, because it didn't teach me the lessons I need to properly maintain them in the future. But so this is just an example of kind of like the spacing, and we can see I have a fence here where we would just start to put in sheep or pigs into this paddock in between. So again, like I said, I was very hands-off with this. I didn't do regular mowing or weed management to help the trees, no irrigation. And I was one person pretty much on the farm. My dad and I were running it. And I was trying to start up a direct marketing business, do farmers markets. So my labor availability was very low, and things were going well, so I just kind of left things be. So one of the issues that we really had with was our stakes. We had to constantly stand trees back up if there's any wind, or if the livestock got out, they would knock over the trees. And another issue was pigs would create wallows, grazing in between just in the summer that they would need so much temperature control without having really any shade out there. So they really produce a lot of wallows. And then we're constantly having to reseed those areas. So the trees, we used either a single line of polywire for cattle, or our sheep, we use this Gallagher smart fence, 3 or 4 strands for sheep and pigs. And that worked pretty good. So here's some pigs out grazing in between. You can see this was in the fall. It was very wet in the last 5 years. Every single fall seemed very wet. And they would just root up that soft soil and create a mess, which creates more work. But for the most part, it worked pretty good to have them in that electrified paddock. So here's our up close. And we did a grant through SARE and with help with the Savannah Institute, and we tested these different tree tubes and different methods. So basically, if you didn't have any protection on the trees, shocker, the animals will eat the trees, or if the pigs, they will literally just play with them. I think they're maniacal in that way, that they knew that they were just tearing up our hard work. But the other tree tubes did all right. Pigs will pretty much just play with it no matter what, so they need an arbor shield. And I'll show you what that is, kind of like a barbed wire cage around it to keep them off the trees. But these other 2 tree tubes, the sheep respected pretty good, but the pigs and cattle are really tough to have them not affect and destroy your crop. So just more examples or charts and the data showing that. So Arbor Shield did great protecting it, but we have some other issues with those. So some of the lessons we learned, one of the biggest things that I just got too gung-ho about stuff. I went full in on like, let's plant as many trees as we can. And I didn't really forecast our growth in the next 5 years. So you saw like that first year, I maybe had 10, 15 hogs in there, and now we're raising over 100 hogs a year. So the scale and the size paddocks that they need, how often you need to move them, I didn't have it set up very well. So you need to think about that more than I did. And that's a big lesson that I learned. So one of the first things, like having wider alleys in my circumstances. This might not make sense for someone else with like that are going to do sheep or smaller herd or use poultry instead. But for me, I'm thinking 60 at the bare minimum, which would mean 20% less trees, or up to 200 feet in between for like maybe cattle or sheep now that we have a flock over 100. So that was very important for us to do. I did those curved like on the key line tree plantings. Total headache to try to set up paddocks in that. So having more of a linear, standard, straight way of setting up paddocks just helps you with having less emotional, mental burden or load during the summer trying to think, okay, what's the size of this paddock, all this type of thing. So having more of a, it's not going to be as beautiful potentially, but having more straight, standard, square type of paddocks was something that I learned and what I will do in the future. And the arbor shields did work very well, but they're kind of expensive. So maybe in the future we'll do some more sporadic plantings rather than doing them in a line, which you have to fence out. The arbor shields don't need electric fencing to protect them. And our tree tubes, we learned a couple different tree tubes work better than others. So these white tree tubes are kind of standard. Those work pretty good. They're a little bit more sturdy and hold up to sheep or anything grazing or rubbing up on them. These blue tree tubes that we use, though, they're like a film, plastic sheath inside of a film, do not work in a livestock operation. They basically fold up like accordions. These arbor shields, you can see they kind of have these barbed wire kind of things. They protect really great, but they also don't protect from like any type of critters on the ground or from forage as much as like a actual tube does. So I'll try to wrap this up here in the next couple minutes, but basically found that Miracle Pro, the tree tubes, those white ones, kind of the cheapest ones, but they're pretty sturdy. They're very quick to install. You could even reuse them, I think, but they have some winter kill issues and lots of wasp nests that happen in them. These Blue X, more expensive. They were not sturdy, very, very slow to install, which really adds up in a larger scale planting. Not reusable. They're flimsy, rough top. Would not recommend them for integration with livestock. Arbor Shield, I actually have this wrong. I think it was like $10 to $15 per. And then they're very sturdy, but very, very slow. And I even, one of them slipped my hand wide open installing them, so they're a little bit more dangerous that way. Very reusable, but you could injure your livestock. We had cuts on some of them. No protection from little critters like rabbits as much, and mice and voles, and lots of competition for forage. So in the future, we think we'd probably plant more Miracle Pro, but with a better stake. So we did a wood planting stake in our very clay soils. It was tough to get the stakes in deep enough without breaking them. So in the future, I think we'd use a fiberglass, which is maybe a little bit more expensive, but we could reuse them a little bit better and a lot more sturdy. Or even potentially a little heavier, but rebarb, which you could potentially resource or source for free or very cheaply if you're resourceful. So, and one of the other things, we kind of put this establishment pretty far away. And in the future, we're going to put it a lot closer, so it's closer in our mind. We see it more often, and we're more likely to maintain it. So just kind of fly through this. A square is the most, or a circle would be the most efficient way to produce a paddock when it comes to the amount of square feet or surface area in the paddock to the amount of perimeter fence that you have to put up. In those 45-foot rows, you had a long, narrow, so there's a lot more work, not as much benefit from it. So I'm running out of time here, so I'll kind of end. But we're going to basically, when we do new tree plantings, we're basically going to use our poultry operations to establish those areas, because they are not going to hurt the trees as much. They don't take as much land. They have a little bit smaller areas that they have. So raising them closer to our roads and our buildings will allow us to have 5 years to get these trees established where we're raising the poultry, and then maybe we'll switch them to a new area, put the sheep in these more established areas until they grow beyond that and can handle cattle and eventually. So kind of having not a succession just in bare field to grassland to trees, but also succession from chickens or poultry, smaller animals, to sheep, and then to livestock like cattle or swine that are going to be more destructive and need a lot more management around these trees. So there's our turkeys that we want to, I think are going to be pretty crucial to this. So here's my contact info. I'd love to, answer any questions people have about how to get started, other lessons. The biggest thing that I can recommend is go help someone else plant trees and get established in that. So you can see how they're doing it, and then you can revisit it in 2-5 years. You can remember what you did, go see, and you're going to learn that way. Farmers want help. They love sharing their experiences and knowledge with people. So go do that. I did that a little bit, and that helped me out a lot. And then I still made a ton of mistakes. So go visit other farms. There's lots in the Midwest starting to work on this. So I'll end it there. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, all three of you. That was super informational and super fast. Jacob, Marty, it's amazing to see the real life, like what you've put into it. I don't know if you guys can see the chat box, but there's a tremendous amount of chat happening. So let's move into a few questions. Tom had asked about experience with CSP enhancements. Jacob, Marty, I don't know if you had used CSP at all in setting this up.
Yeah, so I did a CSP and EQIP contracts. They didn't particularly deal with the tree plantings. They're more about the establishment of the paddocks and the pasture. So I helped with seed buying seed and establishing that. Prescribed grazing. So for 3 years, they made a payment for me to graze the land to get started. They helped with water tanks, water lines, above ground water lines, and also tree posts and all the fencing equipment as well. So make use of those. There is benefits and drawbacks to working with government and entering a contract. So you have to follow certain standards, but for the most part, if you have a good relationship with your agents, I can highly recommend what I did to anyone else. And when you're getting started, you're starting a new venture, you might be starting a new business, that cost sharing payments are huge in helping you get the right footing and getting going. I don't know how much more stress it would have been to have to self-fund, which we had to do a little bit. They don't pay for everything, but it's a considerable amount that they help out with. So
awesome.
CSP also helped, and that's a little bit smaller payment and a little bit more relaxed, but definitely adds up too. And that's more about, I want to say we did like a field day with the Savannah Institute that counted for that. We had to do it kind of fit into what we're already trying to do. So definitely look into those. Yeah.
Perfect. And then Kim also had a question for you about how did you convince your dad to convert from conventional crops to try this system?
Oh boy. I think I shared a link with you before, Greg. I actually gave a presentation speech about that side of things. And I'm still navigating that. But basically, I'm a little stubborn, so my dad definitely wanted to keep passing the farm through the family. I have 3 brothers, none of them have the farming interest in it. So, and I didn't really for the longest time. So when I ended up sharing that I was interested in coming back to the farm, but I had all these crazy ideas because I think about this is where our food system needs to go in the future. He was more just excited that I was going to be back and helping him, and that there was, it wasn't just going to be eventually he was going to pass away and we would inherit the farm and we'd rent it out to someone, that we'd be stewarding this land. And I mean, this is 6 years and we're still trying to figure out the finances of it. Our different styles of management are completely different. Well, not completely different, but there's a lot of differences in butting of heads, but there is something to say about working with family and what that means to it. So that's how I got him going. It was basically, let's give it a shot. We kind of planned out, okay, we might not make that much money for 3-5 years or so, especially when we expanded. We went from 50 to 100 and to 250 acres. So every time you expand, you almost set your 3-year return on investment horizon. You reset that. So I'm in year 6 now, and last year was my first very actual profitable year. So that you have to go into it acknowledging those barriers. And luckily, my dad has a lot of interest, and he's still on the farm full time, so he helped out a ton. He's more important to the farm than I have been. So
awesome. Yeah, I can't seem to find that link, but if you can, later on you can go into the chat and share that, and people can come back and see that as well, because the chat will be saved in there.
Okay.
But Luke, there's been some questions that kind of around the tree planting a little bit. And Luke had asked, did you consider soil type in the aspect of your tree planting? And also, there's been some questions around kind of expected survival rate of your trees. And is that kind of what are you thinking for survival rate in 5 or 10 years?
So soil type, I didn't classify or select different species super closely on that. I mean, we have a pretty general soil type. It's a high quality, so anything that it's not acidic. So I think it was a pretty generic fit that most trees could handle. So, but we do want to look at the surrounding areas. We have tons of oaks, so we know the oaks can survive here. We have wild apple trees that came here somehow that are flourishing. So we're just looking at other examples on the farm that we can kind of replicate. Survival, I basically have scrapped that tree planting. You know, we plant 1,000, and just over the years, deer, but our animals do get out. They don't get out like on our roads that much, but they'll get out of like a temporary paddock, or if like a windstorm blocks stuff. And our sheep, what do? They go straight for the pear and apple trees. They defoliate it because they're providing, you know, some type of nutrition that they need. So we learning from that, I would try to shoot for like 50% if you're going to be able to provide a lot more maintenance on it. But us, like winter kill, we had tons of windstorms and very cold winter the first couple of years. We had tons of winter kill that would take out 50% of the remaining trees in the spring. So, and we're under 10%. But again, I was very hands off, and our livestock were the predominant priority on the in this establishment. So now I got to figure out and learn from that lesson in the future. How do you account for that? Mm-hmm. So I would shoot for 50%.
And I'd be happy just to jump in and offer that, you know, when we're approaching planning out, budgeting this type of system, that we have to build in loss of trees, but that even over the course of this farm, this agroforestry system lasts for 60 years, every year or every couple of years, there will be culling. Typically, there's going to be management needs and need to replant quite often, but hopefully we're able to use our own seed stock if we can get some to survive.
Yep. Yeah, and like if you're going to do like wider rows or something like that, that's going to reduce the amount of trees that you can plant per acre. Maybe plant more per row, expecting that 50 to 75% might die out over 10 years. So maybe double up or something like that, especially if you can have access to cheap source of trees.
All right. Well, fantastic. I think that answers most of the questions. You guys, if you haven't been watching the chat box, go back and look at it on the session page, because there's a lot of brome talk and a lot of tree tube talk. So there's a lot of interest around this. So we have reached the end of our time, but I want to make sure that you guys know that you can set up meetings and invite other people through our public forum area. So feel free to do that, or join our potluck happy hour tonight at 6. And you can gather through the Wander app. You can create some different circles and talk about all these different things as well. So please keep this conversation going, because it's definitely a lot of interest, and you guys have shared a tremendous amount of information. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you guys for presenting and taking the time out of your day to put this together. I want, again, in addition to the happy hour tonight, we have storytelling night with our PFI farmers. So come check that out. It's a lighthearted way to end our conference in this this virtual world. So I'll go ahead and leave this open if anybody has some questions they want to chat out, but we can leave this open for probably another 10 minutes before I think they'll kick us out, if you guys want.
Yeah, that works for me.
All right. Thank you, guys. Can you guys see the chat box on the session page?
I'm going to go there now.
Yeah, check it out. There's a lot of love happening in there too. Oh, Jordan Clausen asked how the trees were planted.
By hand. I had a tree planter that my neighbor and I, he was a forester, so we bought, and I actually just used that to plow the lines and create a furrow. And then later on, we went back in with either a tree spade or just a regular shovel and opened up. Because a lot of our plants trees that we got have a pretty robust root system on them, so they need a big area. So mostly the shovel was the quickest way, and then we just hand installed them and packed the ground a little bit, gave them water the first couple of days, and then that was pretty much it. So awesome. We flagged out everything. We had different flags for each type of tree species, and I had like a crew of 8 friends on 2 different days come in, and we got over 1,000 trees planted in a weekend. So cool.
Jacob, is it Stories on the Pasture? Is that the talk that you were talking about?
What was it called?
Stories? No.
Nope. I can try to find it. I have it saved on YouTube here.
All right, I tried to quickly find it.
Let's see. Let's see. This might be.
And then Dustin Potter had a question in there. I'm looking to add fruit trees to my vegetable production and want to plant them between my production blocks. Can you review your tree order and explain why you chose those trees and what that concept and how that concept would work in his context?
Yeah, so I just shared that link. I found it. Let's see if it goes up on there. Did it go on?
It didn't come up. Go ahead and put it in the Zoom chat and I can try to paste it over.
Okay. So I think I heard the question. So it's multitasking, not the best of that. So at the time, Savannah Institute was doing like a bulk tree order. So those were tree species that they had available. And with the blocks, I just kind of planned out, over the 1,000 acres or 1,000 trees, if every 5 trees, 2 of them are going to be a fruit or nut or a canopy tree, and then the inside, 20% of them are going to be the red buds, and then another 20% are going to be apple and pear each. So I just kind of went off of what Savannah Institute had available at the times because that made it a little bit easier and streamlined for me. And then I'm not sure if that's answering the question completely, but I was basically just using what was made available at the time,
Right.
Which fit into what we wanted. In the future, I'd be really interested in actually buying just bulk seed and maybe starting stuff and getting it going, and then planting maybe more established trees. But I'm not sure if that would actually end up being more successful. I heard a lot of success about planting from seed directly where you want them to grow. So we'll see.
Awesome.
Not sure if that answers the question.
I think you did. Let's see. Do you guys see anything else in there that pops up? I've been trying to multitask as well. Jacob, I got your that link in there.
Cool.
Luke Gran, I don't know, did we address his? He made a really interesting comment about the risk of alternating block planting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really interesting point. And I think what he's getting at is, instead of either alternating one every other, or maybe let's say a whole line of chestnuts, and then hoping that, maybe you thin them out eventually, but that there's this concept that the strongest will grow the tallest. And even if some don't die, you'll have to thin out healthy trees. So I think his concept is that you would plant blocks of trees in groups of 3 or 4, let's say, and then move on to a separate species in a group of 3 or 4.
I see. Now that makes sense. That I misheard the question, I guess, when I was trying to find that link. I would probably do that. Like, I'm thinking about in the future, like with these turkey areas that we might plant, is just do all chestnuts there. In past, I was like really gung-ho about, all right, let's have this alternating diversity, really make it hard for pest and disease to take root or take hold in the area. And I was thinking maybe there's a chance of like having a U-pick type of setup eventually, and that would help reduce that. But looking forward, like, you might have a little bit higher risk of having a pest or disease being able to spread, but as long as you're not having thousands of the same trees in the same area, we have a little bit of diversity, just widespread, across the farm or across the macro landscape. I think that the risk is pretty low. And if it does become an issue, you just have to, handle it at that point. So I would definitely, yeah, maybe the block plantings would be more practical for sure.
Well, it sounds like somebody needs to set up another SARE research project. Marty, Jacob Marty, I nominate you. You don't seem very busy.
Nice. And then I think there's one last one in here. Vicky had commented earlier, she commented about how their farm hasn't been tilled in over 30 years and just having a difficult time with the thought of tillage in that unplowed land. Is there a way to incorporate some of these practices without really disturbing that soil?
100%. Absolutely. In fact, it would be highly encouraged. You would do more harm than good. So if you were going to do this system like Jacob Marty was saying, you know, if you're planting hundreds and hundreds or thousands of trees and you want to run a single, you know, small plow through there, you know, certainly understand that, but there's probably not a tremendous benefit at all to till. You would just, Jacob Marty probably would agree that you just take a shovel out there and plant them individually. And unless, and in fact, because it's not been tilled, you're not going to have that hard till pan underneath of it probably. So the roots are going to have a strong start. They're going to have a relatively easy time spreading out. And then over time, the roots themselves will create the infiltration that you're looking for. They'll break up any compaction. So yeah, absolutely. I'd recommend no tilling at all.
Awesome. All right.
Yeah. And I think, I was to say, I think if you're going to just do a single row of like tillage, you're not going to disrupt things to the point that you're going to lose a lot of benefits. That's if you're going to do it on a large, like, you know, if you do a 10-foot wide scale, that tillage is going to compound and have those issues. But if you're just going to do like a single row or even like a foot or two, I think you're going to maintain most of the qualities of keeping the intact perennial cover.
Awesome. All right. I think we're going to get bumped out here in a minute. So thank you again, guys, and hope to see you at the next virtual thing.